Protean Wave? That's not the name of the mechanic we just saw. What's a oGCD? And what exactly do you mean by an opener? In this video, I will somewhat briefly go over a lot of common, as well as more rare and uncommon phrases, abbreviations and references in Final Fantasy XIV lingo, what some might call Raiderlingo, although sometimes these things are considered so mundane that even the much more casual players know exactly what they mean too. I hope you will find it helpful. Let's start with a bunch of the more frequent and to some degree more commonly known ones. The kinds of abbreviations and phrases that you would see the average player throw around like everyone just knows, just so that we're on the same page. oGCD, global cooldown, refers to two things simultaneously. One, weapon skills and spells are referred to as global cooldowns because they incur a 2 global cooldown whenever they are used. Meaning that the phrase, whenever you use a weapon skill, it initiates the global cooldown, which applies the global cooldown time of that weapon skill to you, putting all of your weapon skills and spells on a global cooldown. Could be spoken with the abbreviation as follows. When you use a oGCD, it initiates the oGCD, which applies the oGCD time of that oGCD to you, putting all of your oGCDs on a oGCD. A small clarification here is that all weapon skills and spells incur this oGCD. However, as there is only one recast timer slot in tooltips, if something has a cooldown in addition to being a weapon skill or spell, it might be unclear what the actual oGCD of the action is. Take for instance Viper's Vicewinder. It turns out it has the same oGCD as Hunter's Coil and Swiftskin's Coil, but that is not clear from the tooltip. oGCD, off global cooldown, refers to abilities. Abilities don't get affected by and don't initiate the global cooldown, hence they are called off global cooldowns. This also means you can use them between oGCDs, leading to weaving, the act of using oGCDs between oGCDs. Single weaving means to use one, double weaving means to use two, and so on. Outside of really specific exceptions, like oGCDs with absurdly long recast timers, double weaving is the most players can typically do. This is because of animation locks. Whenever an action is performed, your character is locked into doing that action for approximately 0.6 seconds plus twice your latency. You can still move during this lock, by the way. At least most of the time. Even with a latency of, say, 20 ms, which is really good and not that common, or so I hear, triple weaving would take 2.56 seconds, which means even something like Vicewinder, which has a oGCD of 2.55 with no skill speed, but with the speed buff, you would still clip momentarily. Take note that while most actions incur this specific animation lock, certain actions appear to have shorter or longer animation locks. For instance, eating food takes significantly longer. And then a few rapid fires. AoE, area of effect, meaning generally attacks that hit multiple enemies. The potency listed for such an action is dealt to every target unless stated otherwise. Dot, damage over time, a debuff that deals damage every 3 seconds unless stated otherwise. Damage over time effects apply the damage they state as well as any other side effects, if any, on a tick, which occurs every 3 seconds, which means several dots applied at different times will still tick together in unison. Hot, healing over time, works exactly the same as dots, but just for healing. The only real difference is that dots can both crit and direct hit, but hots cannot direct hit as healing cannot direct hit. Snapshotting. Depending on context, this can usually mean two different things. When an effect like a dot or a hot is applied, they take a snapshot of the state of the user and the target and determine their total damage or healing per tick at that moment, meaning if you have Raging Strikes active while applying Stormbite, then Stormbite will do increased damage for the whole duration of that specific application of Stormbite. Reapplying it with Iron Jaws leads to a new separate instance of Stormbite that can snapshot separately. The other common instance in which snapshotting comes into play is in the context of boss mechanics. Often, the moment in which a mechanic decides whether it hit you or not is referred to as the snapshot. most of the time, this snapshot happens as the orange telegraph area disappears or the cast bar fills, but it can vary. ABC, always be casting. This is an extension of the concept of the GCD itself. It is commonly known that to make the most of all of your damaging cooldowns, you should use them about as frequently as you can, with the exception being cooldowns that can hold multiple charges, in which case, it may sometimes be better to use them in bursts. However, you can view the GCD itself as a cooldown, and it should always be used whenever it is available. In other words, you should always be quote-unquote casting, with casting referring to keeping the GCD spinning, as it were. Rotation refers generally to the sequence of actions you use in combat. For a lot of jobs, this is a varied sequence that can sometimes seem more like a priority list. It is actually not that common that the sequence loops for so-called rotation. However, this phrase originates from much older games where the attack sequence commonly was a rotation, and the name kinda stuck. A particular example of something that can make a rotation less fixed are procs, programmed random occurrences. This generally refers to anything with a random chance of activating, and both refers to the activation of the thing, but also the thing itself. The Thunder has a 50% chance of proccing the Fire Ready proc. Sometimes, proc can also end up being used to refer to something that is not actually random, using the term to refer to the activation or effect of something just generally. This can get confusing. Gap Closer. Probably self-explanatory, but essentially any action that forcibly moves your character closer to a target. An interesting detail about these is that many of them, even those that appear to be mainly designed to be used for repositioning, deal damage and so are optimally kept on cooldown to get the damage from them. Disengagement tools are essentially the exact opposite of gap closers, and rarely ever have relevant payoffs, and if they do, they might have an alternative spender without movement like Red Mage's Engagement or Engagement. I also like to refer to these as gap wideners, but that's apparently just me. Both of these tools can also be used to perform what is known as a knockback cancel, by using the movement option while you're actively sliding from a knockback mechanic. Moving up to some of the more optimization-centric aspects. Prepull. Some jobs benefit from activating certain actions in anticipation of starting a fight. Some key examples include barrier healers setting up a barrier on the party, or a dancer using standard step beforehand. Casters also tend to start their first spell cast so that their spells land on pull. Pulling, of course, refers to engaging the enemy. Pulling the enemy. Effective pre-pulls kind of require a pull timer though, so most of the time this is mainly seen in harder content, aside from when individuals just blindly start their pre-pull setup hoping the tank will go on time. Saving time by doing something you can do before the fighting starts is an indirect damage gain, of course. Sometimes this is also about starting a cooldown early so you get more of them in the fight. Next, Opener. A specific attack sequence to start a fight with. These are usually pre-designed to make the most of the various cooldowns, and for many jobs also set up the cooldown so they line up nicely over the course of a fight, and sets up future burst windows. Often, an opener also includes the pre-pull setup, if any. Openers are a bit like how chess players memorize various openings to start matches with. In Final Fantasy XIV, however, each opponent always plays nearly the exact same moves every time, so you might as well just use the best opening every time, right? Next, burst window. A time frame where you use a selection of stronger attacks, usually overlapping with a time period of increased damage output. The opener itself is typically also a burst window of its own. Many jobs also have a burst window every minute dictated by a damage buff, like for instance Paladin's Fight or Flight. And a commonly known burst window is also the 2-minute burst. All non-limited combat jobs that have a damage increasing raid buff of some sort will have a 2-minute cooldown time on that exact ability. which means that these are all typically used almost exactly at the same time in the opener, and then again exactly on cooldown, which naturally leads to the 2-minute burst, where most jobs have several of their best attacks become ready naturally, overlapping with this moment where all the damage buffs are active. As damage buffs stack multiplicatively, having more buffs at the same time leads to a greater whole. Simultaneously, as most jobs have several attacks with long cooldowns, getting more value out of these is also super helpful. Sometimes, the 2-minute burst is also referred to as the re-opener. Additionally, it is pretty common to refer to damage increasing raid buffs as simply raid buffs, which can be very confusing or even misleading when defensive raid buffs, like say Red Mage's Magic Barrier, is more likely simply referred to as a defensive cooldown, leading to situations where, for example, Machinists can be said to not have raid support, because they don't have a damage increasing raid buff, despite having not one, but 2 ways of reducing the damage the raid takes through Tactician and Dismantle. And with that, let's talk about some of the more boss mechanic specific abbreviations and Raiderlingo. It can get a bit weird on this one, and it is very likely that some of the shorthands and names for things are something you have never heard before, or alternatively, that you've instead ran into a different name for the thing, as some, if not most, of these names have some history behind them. Chariot and Dynamo, Circle and Donut, Point Blank, Out and In, Ram's Voice and Dragon's Voice, and so on and so on. Many of these names refer to the same 2 things, and some of them refer to them by naming an existing mechanic that is one of the things, and some refer to them by describing them. Chariot and Dynamo are mechanics from Nail Van Darnus, a very old boss, and so rarely actually used terms now, with Chariot being an attack that strikes near the boss in a sort of point-blank circle, and Dynamo strikes away from the boss in a sort of donut shape, the donut hole being the safe spot. I could have named any other pair of mechanics like this, but to put it simply, Chimera from Cutter's Cry has Ram's Voice and Dragon's Voice, which are identical in functionality to Chariot and Dynamo in this specific aspect. Whether those you play with refer to them by descriptive names or by referencing specific mechanics has a tendency to be related to how long they've played the game, or how creative they feel like being with mechanic callouts. The logical reasoning for referring to mechanics with callbacks to previous mechanics with the same functionality is that it can function as a much more effective shorthand, as it can remind the other players of how to deal with it by bringing up the mechanic they do know the solution to. Personally, I prefer to use more quote-unquote descriptive names like Circle and Donut for this particular type. Hotwing and Hottail. It is probably a lot more common to hear Hotwing than Hottail. Both mechanics refer to Nidhogg Extreme, wherein Hottail is a line attack straight through Nidhogg's position and angle. Hotwing makes that same line the safe spot. Simply put, the reason why Hotwing sticks a bit more is because it is a bit more complicated to describe it precisely, whereas Hottail is just a line through the boss. Another example of this kind of mechanic, where the name is very commonly used because the description is lengthy, is Exaflare. Typically, circle AoEs appearing at the edge of an arena or maybe somewhere else, and then crawling across the arena in some predictable direction, repeatedly exploding as they go. They also appear quite frequently in hard content. Another example of this is also Limit Cut, which can get a bit vague, but broadly speaking, involves the entire raid being marked with numbers either 1 through 8 or pairwise 1 through 4, and then typically involves the boss charging through players in this numbered order in some way. The origin of the name is Cruise Chaser from Alexander, but Ravana used it before that, and even a dungeon boss like the second boss in Hallminster Switch uses it. Protean Wave. This one originates from Living Liquid from Alexander, and typically refers to a mechanic that sends out cone-shaped AoEs on all players, which means that you need to spread out so no 2 players overlap their cones. In practice, this usually leads to a more generally known term: Clockspots. Often, all 8 ground markers are placed in a circle around the center of the arena, and each player knows that one of those markers is their clock spot, like an actual physical clock, just with 8 numbers instead of 12. By design, these markers are also often placed in such a way where the numbers and letters alternate, such that one type is on the Cardinals and the others are on the intercardinals. This might sound like big mega nerd talk, but the cardinal directions are, as we all know, simply north, south, east, and west. So intercardinals mean between those. And cardinals and intercardinals are much more often referred to simply because it is shorter to say. Part of the reason why Protean Wave has endured somewhat for some players is due to the frequency in which clock spots are needed for something that is either actually identical to Protean Wave or incredibly similar. Clockspots can also sometimes come up in the context of a mechanic where players have to be careful to not bump into each other, to also make sure there's space for everyone near the boss. In extension of this, baiting typically involves placing yourself in a specific spot so as to bait a mechanic to your position. In a way, Clockspots involves all 8 players baiting a mechanic in a certain way. Finally, Earthshaker is sometimes used to refer to a mechanic where a few players are targeted with an oncoming cone or line AoE. The difference being that it does not involve everyone. It tends to not require clock spots. Spreads and stacks. Spread and stack markers are typically opposites, in that a spread marker is a typically orange circle AoE that is centered on a specific player, so the aim is to make sure no one else is hit. A stack marker, on the other hand, is a yellow circle with inward pointing arrows, which is an attack that is spread evenly between the players in the circle, often requiring multiple players to participate. Sometimes an attack will hit in a stack multiple times, and sometimes the marker will indicate that by having a stack of stack markers. Additionally, more commonly in harder content, both spread markers and stack markers in situations where there are multiple of them on the field at once will apply a debuff that causes you to die if you get hit by more than a single one at the same time, encouraging you to avoid overlapping them. Enumeration, or simply Enums. Essentially, a stack marker with stricter requirements. The more common enum is indicated with a blue circle with a number of blue crystals circling it, often 2. If at least the required amount of players are in the circle, then the mechanic is resolved correctly. If less than that are in it, the players in the circle either just die or are heavily punished. An alternative version of Enums also exists in some older duties such as AF, even with its reworks, shown with a more yellowy circle and more cyan-looking spheres circling the target. The difference with these Enums is that they're even stricter. You need exactly the amount of players requested, otherwise you get punished. In the case of AF, it means 2 players must be in the circle, otherwise everyone in the circle, whether that is 1, 3 or 4, will get punished equally. Next, body checks. This is a more general term, referring to a mechanic that is typically impossible to complete correctly, and so survive, unless everyone is alive. In other words, the boss is checking to make sure you have the correct number of living bodies. The more typical way this is done is with a mechanic that requires all 8 players to participate, such as something as simple as 8 towers or pillars appearing that requires 1 player to stand in each of them, sometimes referred to as soaking. Or you die. But it can also be something more vague, like a catastrophic amount of damage in a stack marker that will overwhelm if you're less than 8 players, but is definitely survivable with 8. However, these are also more flexible body checks, as enough effort can force you through anyway. Sometimes, the punishment for failing a body check can also be that you simply lose some players, making the bad situation worse. Pairs and light parties. A light party is what you use for 4-man content. It is a party of 4. In raids, it isn't uncommon to see mechanics that require you to split up your raid in 2 equally sized groups, meaning 2 light parties. Sometimes, mechanics require you to split up into 4 equally sized teams, which is what is often referred to as pairs. And finally, an easier and less crucial one: main tank and off tank. In older MMOs than Final Fantasy XIV, it was a lot more common that you might have several tanks, with one main one tanking the big bad boss, like the dragon for instance. The other tanks then had to intercept and deal with the other enemies, making them the secondary or off tanks. In more modern settings, it is a lot more common you just have 2 tanks. And if a boss has a more frequent tank switching mechanic or something, then what makes the main and off tank different at all is that the main tank tends to tank first. They are responsible for starting the fight. Sometimes, in Final Fantasy XIV specifically, a boss fight might only really require the second tank to tank at certain specific moments, meaning that their main job is more about using their support options like raid defensives or assisting the main tank in certain ways, which makes the convention of calling it an off tank make a lot more sense. But as both tanks are mostly equal in capacity and responsibility in a lot of fights, it isn't uncommon to see them be called Tank 1 and 2 as well. But the origin of main tank had a bit more significance, you could say. So, I hope you either learned something new or maybe just enjoyed a little bit of history on some of these abbreviations and shorthands. Indeed, some of them don't really make that much sense, but sometimes a name just decides to stick. Do you know of any strange abbreviations or naming conventions for things in Final Fantasy XIV? Or even a different game for that matter? I would love to hear about them in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, line of sight pulling is a somewhat old MMO or even just RPG way of engaging fights, by grabbing the attention of the enemy and then hiding behind a corner to force even the ranged enemies to come to you. Due to how infrequently it is relevant to use this in Final Fantasy XIV, it is not that unusual to meet players that don't even know it is an option. A clear example of a duty where line of sight pull is helpful is Aurum Vale, where the ranged plants can be pulled into the boss room by turning the corner in the first area of the dungeon.